There's a special kind of pain when your own mother looks through you like you don't exist. For Calvin Dawn, that pain became his everyday reality after his divorce. His mother, Viola, publicly cut him off completely for choosing to raise his young daughter, Tessie, all alone. They lived in a cramped rental above a laundromat, barely making ends meet. Then everything changed. A letter arrived. His great-aunt, Thalia, had died and left him her massive Vermont mansion. But standing at those iron gates in the falling snow, Calvin knew something wasn't right. This inheritance felt like more than a gift. The mansion held secrets his mother never wanted him to find. What was Viola so desperate to hide? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's buzz cut through the darkness at 5:30, same as every morning. Calvin Dawn reached out from under the thin comforter and silenced it with practiced precision, careful not to wake Tessie in the next room. The apartment above Grayson's laundromat wasn't much, but it was theirs, and in the 3 years since the divorce, he'd learned to be grateful for small mercies. He sat up slowly, feeling the cold seep through the worn floorboards. December in Massachusetts meant the landlord's idea of adequate heating left much to be desired. Calvin pulled on his thick wool sweater, the one with the patched elbow that Tessie had fixed with mismatched thread last winter, and padded to the narrow kitchen. The apartment consisted of 3 rooms, if you were generous with the definition. A living space that doubled as his bedroom, with a fold-out couch that groaned every time he opened it. A kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and a refrigerator that hummed like a dying bee. In Tessie's room, barely large enough for her twin bed and the bookshelf he'd built from salvaged wood. The bathroom was shared with the hallway, a peculiar arrangement that meant timing your morning routine around the other tenants. But it was clean. That mattered to Calvin. He kept it spotless, taught Tessie to respect what little they had. Some nights, lying on that uncomfortable couch, he wondered what his mother would think if she could see him now. Then he remembered she'd made her feelings abundantly clear 3 years ago, and the wondering stopped. He started the coffee, the cheap kind that came in a plastic container, and began preparing Tessie's lunch. Peanut butter and honey sandwich, an apple he'd gotten on sale, carrots in a small bag. He added 3 of the chocolate chip cookies he'd baked on Sunday, a small luxury they could barely afford, but one he insisted on. She was 11 years old. She deserved something sweet in her day. The floorboards creaked behind him. "You're up early, Dad." Tessie stood in her doorway, wearing her flannel pajamas and thick socks, her dark hair tangled from sleep. She had her mother's eyes, green and observant, but her steady calm was all her own. At 11, she possessed a maturity that sometimes broke Calvin's heart. No child should have to grow up quite so fast. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, handing her a glass of orange juice. "Big day. I'm covering 3 classes at the high school." "Mr. Peterson still out?" "Pneumonia. They're saying another week at least." Calvin poured himself coffee, savoring the warmth of the mug in his hands. "Which means we can actually buy decent groceries this week." Tessie smiled, settling at their small table. "Can we get that pasta sauce you like? The one with the mushrooms?" "We can get the pasta sauce I like," he confirmed. These negotiations had become routine. What small comfort could they afford this week? What little luxury would fit in the budget he'd calculated down to the penny? The coffee maker sputtered its last drops. Through the thin walls, they could hear Mrs. Chen next door starting her day, her television already blaring the morning news. Below them, the laundromat's ancient machines began their daily rumble. The whole building smelled of detergent and steam, a smell that had seeped into their clothes, their furniture, their lives. "Library after school?" Tessie asked, hope lighting her face. "Library after school," Calvin confirmed. It was their ritual, their escape. The public library 3 blocks away had become their sanctuary. Tessie could lose herself in books while Calvin graded papers or planned lessons. The librarian, Mrs. Kowalski, had stopped charging them late fees after she learned their situation. Small kindnesses like that kept them going. As Tessie got ready for school, Calvin's mind drifted to the letter that had arrived yesterday. He'd hidden it in his coat pocket, hadn't shown Tessie yet. Wasn't sure how to process it himself. Great Aunt Thalia had died. A woman he barely remembered. Someone from childhood visits that felt like dreams now. And somehow, impossibly, she'd left him everything. A mansion in Vermont, an estate attorney named Whitmore. A request that he come view the property at his earliest convenience. It felt like a mistake. Like the universe had mixed up addresses and meant to deliver this news to someone else. Someone more deserving. Someone who hadn't failed at a marriage. Who hadn't been publicly disowned by their own mother in front of 15 relatives at Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. He could still hear Viola's voice, cold and final. You have made your choice, Calvin. You have chosen to raise that child alone, to disgrace this family with your failure. You are no longer my son. The words had cut deeper than any blade. His father had stood silent beside her, saying nothing, doing nothing. His siblings had looked away, and Calvin had taken Tessie's small hand and walked out of that house, knowing he would never be invited back. Dad? Tessie's voice pulled him from the memory. You okay? He looked at his daughter, this brave, brilliant girl who read constantly because books were free at the library, who never complained about their cramped apartment or her second-hand clothes, who had learned to be happy with less than any child should have to accept. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking. About Grandma? He shouldn't have been surprised, she'd guessed. Tessie was perceptive, always had been. A little. Do you miss her? The question was complicated. Did he miss the mother who'd raised him? Yes, desperately. Did he miss the woman who'd looked through him like he was nothing? That was harder to answer. I miss who I thought she was, he said finally. But that's a conversation for another day. We've got to get you to school. The morning routine continued. Tessie dressed in her carefully maintained clothes. Nothing fashionable, but clean and pressed. Calvin packed his worn leather satchel with the teaching materials he'd spent Sunday night preparing. They walked the 6 blocks to Tessie's school together, their breath fogging in the December air. Love you, Dad, Tessie said at the school entrance, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. Love you more, he replied. The same exchange they'd had every morning for 3 years. He watched her disappear into the building, then turned toward the high school where he'd spend the next 8 hours teaching other people's children, earning just enough to keep them fed and housed, but never quite enough to get ahead. The letter in his pocket felt heavy. A mansion in Vermont. It sounded impossible. It sounded like the answer to prayers he'd stopped praying. It also sounded too good to be true. That night, after the library and dinner, spaghetti with butter and the last of the Parmesan cheese, Calvin finally showed Tessie the letter. They sat together on the lumpy couch, the television off, the apartment quiet except for the laundromat's distant rumble. Tessie read carefully, her lips moving slightly as she processed each word. When she finished, she looked up at him with those serious green eyes. The mansion? That's what it says. Did you know her? Great Aunt Thalia? Barely. We visited once when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. I remember a big house and a woman who let me explore everywhere, who didn't scold when I got dirty. She gave me cookies and told me stories. The memories were faint, like photographs left in sunlight too long. Your grandmother never talked about her. I always wondered why. Are we going to see it? That was the question he'd been wrestling with all the day. The practical part of him said yes. Even if they didn't keep it, even if it needed to be sold, an inheritance was an inheritance. It could change everything for them. But the cautious part, The part that had learned not to hope too hard because disappointment hurt worse when you'd allowed yourself to dream. That part said to be careful. I think we should, he said slowly. At least see what we're dealing with. The attorney says there's an estate, some property. Even if we sell it, that could mean real stability for us. Tessie nodded, but her expression had turned thoughtful. Do you think Grandma knows? About the inheritance? I don't know. I haven't spoken to your grandmother in 3 years, Tessie. She made it clear she didn't want contact. That's sad, Tessie said quietly. She's missing so much. Missing you. Missing me. Out of the mouths of babes, Calvin thought. His 11-year-old daughter had more emotional wisdom than his 67-year-old mother. It is sad, he agreed. But sometimes people make choices they can't take back, or won't take back, and we have to live our lives anyway. They sat together in comfortable silence. Outside, someone's car alarm went off, then stopped. Mrs. Chen's television murmured through the walls. The building settled with its familiar creaks and groans. When would we go? Tessie asked. Winter break starts next week. We could drive up, meet with the attorney, see the place, make some decisions. What if it's amazing? Then we figure out what to do with amazing. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's probably going to need work. Might be falling apart. Might not even be worth the property taxes. But even as he said it, a small flame of hope flickered in his chest. A mansion in Vermont. A great-aunt who'd remembered him when his own mother had forgotten. Maybe, just maybe, something good could come from loss. Maybe Thalia's death could mean Tessie's future. Could mean a real home instead of 3 rooms above a laundromat. That night, lying on his fold-out couch, Calvin pulled out his laptop and searched for information about Thalia Dorn. He found an obituary from a Vermont paper. Thalia Dorn, 87, passed peacefully at her home in Millbrook on December 2nd. She survived by her great-nephew Calvin Dorn and his daughter Tessie. Miss Dorn lived a quiet life devoted to charitable work and the arts. She was known for her generosity and kind spirit. A private service will be held. Known for her generosity. That stirred something in Calvin's memory. He remembered Thalia's warm smile, the way she'd listened to his childhood chatter as if every word mattered. He remembered thinking, even at 5 years old, that she was different from the other adults in his life. She'd been present, attentive, kind. Why hadn't Viola maintained contact with her own aunt? What had caused that rift? The questions chased themselves through his mind as he finally drifted to sleep. In his dreams, he walked through a vast house filled with rooms he'd never seen, searching for answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. When morning came, the decision was made. They would go to Vermont. They would meet with Mr. Whitmore. They would see what Thalia had left them and why, and maybe, just maybe, they'd find something more than an inheritance. Maybe they'd find a place to finally call home. The drive to Vermont took 6 hours through increasingly heavy snow. Calvin's 12-year-old Honda struggled with the mountain roads, but it persevered, much like its owner. Tessie sat in the passenger seat with a book in her lap, though she spent more time looking out the window at the white-covered landscape than reading. It's like a different world, she said softly as they passed through small towns where Christmas decorations hung from old-fashioned lampposts. Your great-great-aunt chose well, Calvin replied. If you're going to live somewhere quietly, Vermont seems like the place. The GPS led them off the main road onto narrower streets, then finally to a private lane marked by a simple wooden sign. Blackwood Estate. The name stirred nothing in Calvin's memory, but as they drove up the winding driveway, something else did. The towering pines, the way the road curved just so. He'd been here before. Long ago, but the landscape remembered even if he'd forgotten. Then they rounded the final bend. and Calvin's breath caught. The mansion rose before them like something from another era. 3 stories of Victorian elegance, painted a deep charcoal gray with white trim. A wraparound porch, peaked roofs, windows that seemed to watch their approach. Snow covered everything, softening the edges, making it look almost magical in the fading afternoon light. "Dad," Tessie whispered. "It's huge." Huge didn't begin to cover it. The house Calvin had grown up in could have fit in one wing. The apartment above the laundromat could have fit in a closet. He pulled up to the front entrance where a Mercedes was already parked. As they climbed out, the cold hit them immediately, sharper than Massachusetts cold, somehow cleaner. The front door opened, and a man in his 60s stepped out, wearing a wool coat and carrying a briefcase. "Mr. Dawn, I'm Richard Whitmore. We spoke on the phone." Calvin shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the assessing gaze that took in his threadbare coat and worn boots. "Thank you for meeting us. This is my daughter, Tessie." "Miss Tessie," Whitmore smiled at her, warmer now. "Your great-great-aunt would have been delighted to meet you. She always wanted family to fill this house again." He produced an old-fashioned iron key from his pocket, ornate and heavy. "Shall we?" The key turned smoothly in the lock. Someone had maintained it well. The door swung open on silent hinges, and they stepped into another world. The entry hall was grand, but not ostentatious. Hardwood floors, a sweeping staircase, furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Everything was clean despite months of vacancy. Dust motes danced in the light from tall windows, but there was no sense of decay, no feeling of abandonment. "The estate has been maintained by local service," Whitmore explained as he led them deeper inside. "Per Miss Dawn's instructions and prepaid contract. The heating has been kept at minimum levels to prevent pipe damage, though we can have it raised now that you're here." Now that you're here. As if it were already decided they'd stay. They walked through room after room, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, many volumes still in place. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20. A music room with a grand piano under a cloth cover. A kitchen that was surprisingly modern, clearly renovated within the last decade. Multiple sitting rooms, each with its own character and charm. Tessie's eyes grew wider with each discovery. She paused in the library, running her fingers along the spines of books, her expression reverent. In the music room, she carefully lifted the piano cover, revealing polished wood and ivory keys. "Did she play?" Tessie asked. "Beautifully, from what I understand," Whitmore replied. "Though in her later years, her arthritis made it difficult." The second floor held 6 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom. One was clearly Thalia's, kept as she'd left it, with personal items still on the dresser, a reading chair by the window, a bed made with a faded quilt. The others were guest rooms, waiting for visitors who rarely came. The third floor was an attic space, partially finished, filled with trunks and boxes and decades of accumulated memories. When they returned to the main floor, Whitmore led them to a study off the library. He gestured for them to sit in leather chairs worn soft with age, then opened his briefcase and withdrew several documents. "The will is straightforward," he began. "Miss Thalia Dawn leaves her entire estate. The house, grounds, all furnishings, and a trust fund established for maintenance and taxes, to her great-nephew Calvin Dawn and his descendants. There are no strings attached, no requirements. It is yours to do with as you wish." Calvin felt dizzy. "A trust fund? For property taxes, basic upkeep, utilities. Approximately $40,000 per year, adjusted for inflation." Miss Dawn was quite practical in her planning. She didn't want the estate to become a burden. $40,000 per year, more than Calvin made in a good year of substitute teaching. "I don't understand," Calvin said slowly. "Why me? I barely knew her. There must be other family. Closer family." Whitmore's expression became carefully neutral. "There are other relatives, yes. Your mother, for instance. But Miss Dawn was very specific. The estate goes to you. My mother knows about this. I am not at liberty to discuss that, Mr. Dawn. However, the will was filed properly, all notifications sent as required by law. If anyone had wished to contest, they had ample opportunity. Calvin sat back, mind reeling. Viola knew, had to know, and she'd said nothing, done nothing. The silence spoke volumes. There's something else, Whitmore continued. Miss Dawn left this for you specifically. She asked that I give it to you when you first saw the house. He withdrew an envelope from his briefcase, aged but carefully preserved. Calvin's name was written on it in elegant script. With trembling hands, Calvin opened it. Inside was a single page, the same elegant handwriting. Dear Calvin, he read aloud, his voice catching. If you're reading this, then I've gone on, and you've come home. I know you don't remember me well. You were so young during your visits, and then they stopped. I want you to know that was never my choice. This house has been too quiet for too long. It needs laughter again. It needs a child's footsteps on these stairs. It needs you. I've watched from afar as best I could, through what little news reached me. I know about your struggles, your courage, your good heart. This house is yours because you deserve it, because you'll use it well, because you understand what matters. But more than that, it's yours because you were always meant to be here. There are things in this house, papers, letters, pieces of history. Take your time with them, understand your story, your family's story, and know that whatever you discover, you were loved, always loved. Welcome home, Calvin, with all my heart, Thalia. The room was silent except for the old clock ticking on the mantel. Tessie had tears on her cheeks. Even Whitmore looked moved. She knew about us. Calvin's voice was hoarse. About our situation. Miss Dawn was more connected than her isolation might suggest, Whitmore said carefully. She had ways of learning about family, even when contact was cut off. Even when contact was cut off. By Viola. Always by Viola. Mr. Dawn, I should tell you. Whitmore hesitated. There's a room on the second floor. The one with the locked door you might have noticed. Miss Dawn's instructions were specific. That room is not to be opened until you're ready. The key is in her bedroom, in the bottom drawer of her dresser. But she wanted you to choose the moment. What's in it? Family papers, history, things she thought you should know but not be forced to confront immediately. More secrets. More things Viola had never shared. Calvin looked at Tessie, saw hope and wonder in her face, looked around at the beautiful study, imagined them living here, really living here. Heat that worked, rooms to breathe in, a library for Tessie, stability, safety, home. We'd like to accept, he said, if that's all right. We'd like to stay. Whitmore smiled, genuine warmth replacing his professional demeanor. Miss Dawn would be very pleased. I'll have the paperwork prepared. In the meantime, the house is fully functional. The trust can advance funds for groceries, supplies, whatever you need to settle in. That night, after Whitmore had left, after they'd chosen bedrooms and brought in their few bags from the car, Calvin stood in the kitchen making hot chocolate. Through the window, he could see snow falling steadily, blanketing the grounds in deeper white. Tessie appeared in the doorway, wearing her pajamas and thick socks. Dad, is this real? He held out his arms and she came to him, letting him hold her close. It's real, sweetheart. It's really real. Why did Great Aunt Thalia do this for us? I don't know yet, but I think we're going to find out. Outside, the wind picked up, howling softly around the eaves. The house settled around them with creaks and sighs, learning the weight of new occupants. And somewhere, locked away on the second floor, secrets waited to be discovered. The first week passed in a blur of discovery and adjustment. The heating system, once cranked up to comfortable levels, revealed itself to be remarkably efficient despite the house's age. Calvin learned which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, which rooms caught the morning sun. The house was teaching them its rhythms, and they were learning to move within them. Tessie claimed the bedroom overlooking the gardens, a space twice the size of their entire apartment back home. She spent hours arranging her books on the built-in shelves, setting up her small collection of treasures on the windowsill. Calvin took a room down the hall, modest by the house's standards, but palatial compared to his fold-out couch. They explored systematically, one room per day. The house revealed itself in layers. Each space held remnants of Thalia's life. A half-finished crossword puzzle, reading glasses left on a side table, slippers beneath a chair. It felt both strange and comforting, like being trusted with someone's private world. On the fourth day, while investigating the kitchen's many cabinets, Tessie discovered the recipe box. It sat on a high shelf, a faded tin decorated with painted strawberries. She brought it down carefully, and they opened it together at the kitchen table. Inside were hundreds of recipe cards, each in the same elegant handwriting from Thalia's letter. Some were yellowed with age, ingredients listed in measurements that predated standardization. Others were more recent, clipped from magazines and annotated in the margins. "Look, Dad." She wrote notes on everything. Tessie pulled out a card for apple pie. In the margin, Thalia had written, "Used Vermont apples, September 1982. Perfect day." They spent an hour reading through the cards, each one a small window into Thalia's life. But as Calvin examined them more closely, he noticed something odd. Some cards had dates that seemed wrong. A recipe for Christmas cookies noted December 1965 for the last good year. A pork roast recipe. Made this for V's birthday, June 1966. She didn't come. V. Viola. Why did she write those things? Tessie asked, her finger tracing the spidery script. "I don't know," Calvin admitted. "But I think maybe Aunt Thalia was keeping track of more than just recipes." The next morning, they ventured into town. Millbrook was quintessentially Vermont. A main street with a general store, a diner, a small library, and a handful of other shops. Christmas decorations hung from every lamppost, and people moved with the unhurried pace of those who knew their neighbors. At the general store, an elderly woman behind the counter looked up as they entered. Her name tag read, "Betty." "You must be Thalia's great-nephew," she said, no question in her statement. "Word travels fast here. Welcome to Millbrook." "Thank you. I'm Calvin, and this is Tessie." Thalia was a good woman, Betty said, ringing up their groceries. Kept to herself mostly, but generous when it counted. Paid off medical bills for folks who couldn't manage. Funded the school library. Never wanted recognition. "I'm learning she was remarkable," Calvin replied. "She was that." Betty paused, then added carefully, "She talked about you sometimes. Said she hoped you'd find your way here eventually." The words settled over Calvin like a warm blanket. Thalia had thought of him, had hoped, had waited. They were loading groceries into the car when a woman approached. She was perhaps 70, wearing a practical winter coat and boots, her silver hair pinned back neatly. Calvin Dorn. At his nod, she extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Pelletier. I live about a mile down the road. I knew your great-aunt." "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Pelletier." "Please, call me Margaret. I wanted to welcome you and see if you need anything. Settling into that big house can't be easy." "We're managing, thank you. Everyone has been very kind." Margaret's eyes, a sharp blue, studied him. "You look like your mother. Same bone structure." The mention of Viola created an awkward pause. Margaret seemed to notice. "I knew Viola too," she said quietly. "Long ago, before she left Vermont." Calvin's attention sharpened. "My mother lived here?" "Oh yes." She and Thalia both, before Thalia took over the house permanently. Margaret glanced at Tessie, who was examining a snowbank, then back to Calvin. There's history in that house, Calvin. Things Thalia lived with for a long time. If you need someone to talk to while you're sorting through it all, I'm available. Before he could respond, she pressed a casserole dish into his hands. Chicken and vegetables. Just warm it through. Consider it a welcome to the neighborhood gift. She walked away before he could thank her properly, leaving Calvin standing in the snowy parking lot, holding a casserole and a dozen new questions. That evening, after they'd eaten Margaret's excellent casserole, and Calvin returned to the recipe box, he sorted through it more carefully now, looking for patterns. The cards with dates and personal notes spanned decades, from the 1960s through just a few months before Thalia's death. One card caught his attention. It was for sugar cookies. The recipe itself standard, but the note made him pause. Made these for V's wedding that never happened. June 1963. She made the right choice, even if no one else thinks so. A wedding that never happened. The right choice. Calvin set the card aside and continued searching. Another note on a recipe for beef stew. Comfort food for dark days. V called today, first time in 30 years. She hung up when she heard my voice. April 1996. His mother had called, had heard Thalia's voice and hung up. The cruelty of it struck him hard. There were more cards with similar notes, a chronicle of attempted connections and rejected overtures. Thalia reaching out. Viola pulling away. The pattern repeated across decades, a record of sisterly love met with stubborn silence. The last dated card made his throat tight. It was from just 8 months ago, a simple recipe for lemon bars. In the margin, Thalia had written, I'm dying, and she still won't speak to me. But Calvin will come. I believe that. He'll come, and maybe he can do what I couldn't. Make her remember there was good before all the bad. Dad? Tessie's voice from the doorway startled him. You okay? He wiped his eyes quickly. Yeah, sweetheart. Just thinking. She came to sit beside him, looking at the scattered recipe cards. She missed Grandma, didn't she? She did. And Grandma never came. No. Tessie was quiet for a moment. People are complicated. Out of the mouths of babes. They are indeed. That night Calvin couldn't sleep. He wanted the house, learning it in darkness. The shadows seemed deeper, more knowing. He found himself standing outside the locked room on the second floor, the one Whitmore had mentioned. Family papers, history, things Thalia wanted him to know. He wasn't ready yet, but he was beginning to understand that ready or not, he needed to know. The recipe box had shown him that much. There was a story here, a painful story that had shaped his mother into the woman who could disown her own son. A story that had kept two sisters apart for decades. He thought about Margaret Pelletier's words. There's history in that house, things Thalia lived with for a long time. Standing in the dark hallway, snow falling softly outside the windows, Calvin made a decision. He would find out what happened. He would understand why Viola had cut herself off from everyone who loved her. Not to excuse her cruelty, but to understand it, and maybe, just maybe, to find a way to break the cycle before Tessie inherited another generation of family silence. The house creaked around him, settling into the cold night. Somewhere in its many rooms, answers waited. Calvin just had to be brave enough to find them. 3 days later, while searching for extra blankets in Thalia's bedroom, Calvin found the photograph. It had slipped between the mattress and bed frame, discovered only when he'd pulled the bed away from the wall to reach a fallen pillow. The photo was faded but clear. 2 young women stood arm in arm at what appeared to be a summer fair. They wore sundresses from the early 1960s, their hair styled in the fashion of the time. Both were laughing at something beyond the camera's frame, faces lit with genuine joy. Calvin recognized Thalia from other photos around the house. She'd had the same kind eyes throughout her life. But the other woman made his breath catch. Viola, his mother, no older than 30, radiant with happiness. She looked nothing like the stern, cold woman who'd disowned him. This Viola was beautiful, unguarded, alive. On the back, in Thalia's handwriting, Summer Fair, July 1963, the last good summer, V and me before everything changed. Before everything changed, the phrase echoed the recipe card note, December 1965, the last good year. Something had happened between 1963 and 1965 that had fractured his mother's life and driven the sisters apart. Calvin began searching more deliberately. If there were clues in the recipe box, there would be more elsewhere. He started with Thalia's bedroom, going through drawers carefully, respectfully. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath folded sweaters, he found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. They were Thalia's letters to Viola, returned unopened. Postmarks spanned from 1967 to 2005. Dozens of attempts at contact, all rejected. But tucked among them were 3 letters that had been opened. 3 times Viola had read what her sister had to say. Calvin sat on the floor and read them. The first, postmarked March 1967. Dearest V, I know you're angry. I know you blame me. But I swear on everything I hold sacred, I never told them. I never betrayed you. Whatever they said, whatever they claimed, it wasn't me. Please, can we talk? Please don't shut me out. You're my sister. I love you. T. The second, July 1980. V, it's been 13 years. I miss you every day. I see you got married, had children. I'm so happy for you, and so sad I wasn't there. Please, we're the only ones left to remember. We're the only ones who know the truth. Don't let that die with silence. T. The third, November 1995. Viola, I'm begging you. Let me explain what really happened. Let me tell you what I found out after you left. You're carrying guilt that isn't yours to bear, and anger at me that I don't deserve. I understand why you thought what you thought, but you were wrong. Please, before it's too late. T. What had Viola thought? What guilt? What had Thalia discovered? The letters raised more questions than they answered, but they confirmed one thing. Whatever had happened wasn't simple. There were layers here, misunderstandings built on misunderstandings. Financial reality intruded on his historical research. The trust fund covered the house's maintenance, but they still needed income. Calvin reached out to the local school district and was hired almost immediately as a substitute teacher. Apparently, rural Vermont had the same teacher shortage as everywhere else. Tessie enrolled at Millbrook Elementary. On her first day, Calvin walked her to the small brick building, noting how different it was from her crowded Boston school. Here, everyone seemed to know everyone. The principal, Mrs. Crawford, greeted them personally. We're delighted to have you, Tessie. Your great-great-aunt was very generous to our school. We have a beautiful library, thanks to her. She donated a library? Calvin asked. Oh, yes. About 15 years ago, she funded a complete renovation and restocking. Said every child deserved access to books. Mrs. Crawford smiled warmly. She had strong feelings about education. Used to say it was the one thing no one could take away from you. After school, Tessie bubbled with excitement. She'd made a friend, a girl named Sophie who also loved to read. They'd eaten lunch together and planned to meet at the library over the weekend. Watching his daughter smile so freely, seeing her settle into a life with space and stability, Calvin felt the weight of gratitude. Whatever Thalia's motives, whatever family drama had driven her choices, she'd given them an incredible gift. That weekend, while Tessie was at the library with Sophie, Calvin accepted Margaret Pelletier's invitation for coffee. Her house was smaller than Thalia's, but equally well maintained, filled with the comfortable clutter of a long life. "I knew you'd come eventually," Margaret said, pouring coffee into delicate china cups. "No one can live in that house without becoming curious about its ghosts. You said you knew my mother." "I did. We all did. Millbrook was smaller back then. Everyone knew the Dorn sisters. Beautiful, inseparable. Thalia was the practical one. Steady. Viola was the dreamer, passionate about everything." "What happened to her?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying him. "How much do you know?" "Almost nothing. I know there was a falling out. I know my mother blamed Thalia for something. I know there was a wedding that didn't happen in 1963. "Robert Carlyle," Margaret said. "Good man, came from money. Their parents arranged it, and Viola went along at first. Then she fell in love with someone else." "Who?" "That's where it gets complicated, Calvin. And painful. Are you sure you want to know?" "I need to understand her. She disowned me, Margaret. Cut me off completely for the crime of being a divorced single father. I need to know why she became so rigid, so cruel." Margaret sighed. "She wasn't always cruel. Before it all went wrong, Viola was the kindest person I knew. But people do terrible things to themselves when they're trapped between love and duty." She stood and retrieved a scrapbook from a shelf. "I kept these. Newspaper clippings mostly. I was young then, impressionable. I thought it was all terribly romantic until it turned tragic." She opened to a page showing a newspaper article from August 1966. The headline read, "Barn Fire Claims Local Man." The article was brief, reporting that James Whitmore, 28, had died in a barn fire on the outskirts of town. The cause was listed as accidental, likely a cigarette. James Whitmore. The name rang familiar. "The attorney's uncle," Margaret confirmed. "That's not a coincidence. Richard knows your history. He's known all along." Calvin stared at the photo accompanying the article. A handsome young man with kind eyes and an easy smile. "This was who my mother loved?" "Yes. And it destroyed her when he died. Destroyed a lot of people, actually. Nothing was the same after that night." "What happened?" "The official story was an accident. But there were rumors. Always rumors in small towns. Some said it was suicide. Others said it was murder. The truth died with James and whatever secrets that barn held." Calvin felt cold despite the warm room. "And Thalia?" "Thalia tried to help them. She knew about their relationship, knew Viola was planning to break off the engagement to Robert. The barn where James died was on Thalia's family's land. Some people thought she'd helped arrange a meeting place. When James died there, and Viola left town immediately after, people talked. Her parents blamed Thalia. They claimed she'd corrupted Viola, led her astray. They never forgave her." The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture both clearer and more complex than Calvin had imagined. "And Viola blamed Thalia too." "That's what I always assumed. She left, married someone else quickly, never came back. As far as I know, she never spoke to Thalia again." Calvin sat back, mind racing. His mother had loved James Whitmore. James had died in a fire. Viola had fled and built a new life, one governed by rigid rules and unforgiving standards. She had married someone, Calvin's legal father, and lived a lie. No wonder she'd become so hard. No wonder she couldn't forgive Calvin's failure at marriage. She'd sacrificed everything for the appearance of propriety, and he'd chosen truth and his daughter over reputation. He was living the life she'd been too afraid to live. The key to the locked room had been waiting exactly where Whitmore said it would be. Calvin held it in his palm now, a small brass key that felt heavy with significance. He'd put off opening that door for 2 weeks, but after his conversation with Margaret Pelletier, the time had come. Tessie was at school. The house was quiet except for the wind outside and the familiar creaking of old wood. Calvin stood before the locked door on the second floor, key in hand, and allowed himself one moment of hesitation. Once he opened this door, once he learned what Thalia wanted him to know, there would be no going back. He turned the key. The room was a study, smaller than the one downstairs but more personal. A desk faced the window, looking out over the snow-covered gardens. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with novels, but with journals, photo albums, and carefully labeled boxes. This was Thalia's archive, her private repository of family history. On the desk lay a single item, a diary, leather-bound and worn. A note rested on top in Thalia's handwriting. Start here, 1962-1966. The years that matter. Calvin sat in the desk chair and opened the diary. The first entries were mundane, charming snapshots of daily life. Thalia wrote about teaching at the local elementary school, about dinners with Viola, about their parents' increasingly rigid expectations. The tone was light, optimistic. Then, June 1963. V told me today she's engaged to Robert Carlyle. She doesn't love him, I can see it in her eyes. But mother and father are so pleased, and V has always wanted to please them. I worry about her. Marriage without love is a prison, and V's spirit needs freedom. The entries that followed documented Viola's engagement, her growing unhappiness, and then, in October 1963, a significant shift. V met someone. She won't tell me who, says it's safer if no one knows. But she's different now. Alive in a way she hasn't been in months. She's glowing. I'm happy for her, but terrified too. If mother and father find out, there will be hell to pay. Calvin read faster, poured into the story. Throughout 1964, Thalia's entries tracked Viola's secret romance. References to stolen meetings, coded letters, the constant fear of discovery. Thalia clearly knew who Viola was seeing. But she never wrote the name, only initials, J.W. James Whitmore. By early 1965, the situation was deteriorating. Viola wanted to break off her engagement to Robert, but their parents forbade it. The wedding was planned for June. The family reputation depended on it. March 1965. V is desperate. She and Jay want to run away together, but she's afraid of what it will do to the family. Father has already threatened to disown her if she embarrasses him. I told her real love is worth the risk, but she's so scared. I offered to help them, to let them use the old barn on the property as a meeting place. Somewhere private where they could talk without fear. Was that wrong? I don't know anymore. Calvin's chest tightened. Thalia had helped them, had given them the barn, and James had died there. May 1965. They're planning to elope next month before the wedding to Robert. Jay has saved money, has a job lined up in Boston. V will break the engagement just before they leave. I'm so proud of her courage, and so afraid of Father's reaction. But she deserves happiness, they both do. Then a gap. No entries for 3 weeks. When the diary resumed, the handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. June 15th, 1965. He's dead. James is dead. The barn burned last night, and he was inside. They say it was an accident, a cigarette, but I don't believe it. V won't speak. She came here after, covered in soot, in shock. She wouldn't tell me what happened. She just kept saying, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." Then her parents came and took her away. They're sending her somewhere, won't say where. They blame me. Father said I corrupted V, that I helped her sin, that I'm responsible for this tragedy. They've cut me off completely. June 20th, 1965. V left a note. It said, "You told them. You betrayed me. I'll never forgive you." But I didn't tell anyone. I kept her secret. I protected her. How can she think I betrayed her? What happened that night? What does she believe I did? The subsequent entries chronicled Thalia's pain and confusion. She'd been exiled from her own family, blamed for something she didn't understand. She'd moved permanently to the mansion, using her inheritance to live independently. For months, the entries were filled with grief and questions. Then, November 1965. I've been investigating, asking questions, piecing together what I can. Mrs. Morrison at the post office finally told me something. She said father was there that night, at the barn. She saw his car leaving around the time the fire started. Why was father there? Did he follow V? Did he confront James? December 1965. I confronted mother today. Asked her directly if father had anything to do with James's death. She didn't deny it. She said, your father protected this family from disgrace. That's all you need to know. Protected this family. Dear God, did father start that fire? Did he kill James? And V thinks I told him where to find them. Calvin's hands shook. His great-grandfather had murdered James Whitmore, and Viola thought Thalia had betrayed her location. The entries continued, documenting Thalia's attempts to reach Viola, to tell her the truth. But Viola had married someone else, a man named Edward Dorn, Calvin's legal father, just 6 months after James's death. She'd rebuilt her life quickly, desperately, burying her past. January 1966. V is pregnant, I heard through relatives who still speak to me. The timing means it's James's child. She's married to Edward, and she'll raise James's baby as his. The lie compounds the tragedy, and she still won't let me explain what really happened. Calvin set the diary down, feeling dizzy. He was James Whitmore's son, not Edward Dorn's. His entire identity, his entire family tree was built on lies and griefs. He stood and searched the room more thoroughly. In a box labeled evidence, he found newspaper clippings, witness statements Thalia had collected over the years, and a folder labeled Fire Investigation Unofficial. Inside were handwritten notes from a retired fire inspector Thalia had hired privately in 1975. The inspector's conclusion: fire originated from accelerant near the barn door, not from interior smoking materials, as official report claims. Pattern consistent with intentional ignition. Victim likely trapped by external force. Official investigation was cursory, possibly influenced by family standing in community. Calvin sat on the floor, surrounded by the detritus of family tragedy. His grandfather had murdered the man his mother loved. Viola had spent her whole life carrying guilt that belonged to her father, and Thalia had lived in exile, blamed for a betrayal she never committed. No wonder his mother had become so rigid, so unforgiving. She'd survived by building walls, by following rules, by never allowing herself or anyone else to deviate from the path of propriety. Calvin's divorce, his choice to be a single father, had threatened that carefully constructed life, had reminded her of everything she'd lost. Understanding didn't equal forgiveness, but it was a start. Calvin spent the rest of the day in that room, reading through everything Thalia had compiled. There were more diaries, covering the decades that followed. Letters Thalia had written but never sent, detailing what she'd learned, begging Viola to listen. And finally, a shoebox hidden behind a loose baseboard in the closet, discovered only when Calvin accidentally knocked against it while reaching for another box. The shoebox was labeled simply, V Correspondence 1967-1970. Inside were the few letters Viola had actually sent in response to Thalia's relentless attempts at contact her. Calvin handled them carefully, feeling like an intruder in his mother's pain. The first, dated April 1967, was brief and bitter. Stop writing to me. You told them where we were meeting. You told father. Because of you, James is dead and my life is ruined. I can never forgive you. Don't contact me again. V. Thalia's response, also in the box, unsent. I didn't tell anyone. I would never have betrayed you. It was father who killed James, not some accident. I have evidence if you'll just let me show you. Please, V. I'm your sister. I love you. I would never hurt you. Key. Another letter from Viola, dated July 1968. I don't care about your evidence. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring him back. I have a son now. I have a life I'm building. I can't look back. Stop trying to make me look back. V. A son. She'd been writing about him, about Calvin. The correspondence was sparse. 3 letters from Viola over 3 years, each colder than the last. And then nothing. Viola had stopped responding entirely, but Thalia had kept trying, kept writing, right up until her death. The final unsent letter, dated just 3 months before Thalia died, read, V, I'm dying. Cancer. I have months, maybe less. I'm not writing for forgiveness anymore. I'm writing because Calvin deserves to know his real father. He deserves to know that James was a good man who loved you completely. He deserves to know you're carrying anger meant for our father, not for me. I'm leaving him the house. I'm leaving him all of this. The history, the truth. He'll find it, and he'll understand what you never let yourself understand. You made James's child pay for your guilt, just like our parents made you pay for theirs. Break the cycle, Viola, before it's too late. T. Calvin sat with that letter for a long time, tears streaming down his face. Thalia had understood everything, had seen the pattern so clearly, and she'd given him this inheritance not just as financial security, but as truth, as ammunition to break the cycle. That evening, Margaret Pelletier appeared at the door with another casserole and a knowing look. You found it, she said simply. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Because I know that look. The one that says the world just reorganized itself around you. She set the casserole on the kitchen counter. May I sit? They settled in the library, and Calvin found himself telling her everything. The diary, the letters, the evidence that his grandfather had murdered James Whitmore. That he, Calvin, was James's son, not Edward Dorn's. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression brave. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I suspected some of it, she admitted. The timing never made sense otherwise. You were born 8 months after the fire. Either Viola had an incredibly premature baby who somehow survived in 1966, or you were James's child. Did Richard Whitmore know? Almost certainly. His father, James's brother, knew about the affair. He would have known about you, but your mother's husband accepted you as his, and that made you legally his son. No one was going to challenge it. Calvin thought about Edward Dorn, the man he'd called father until his death 10 years ago. A distant man, emotionally unavailable, but never cruel. Had he known? Had he raised another man's child out of love for Viola? Or out of duty? What do I do with this? Calvin asked. This information changes everything, but my mother won't even take my calls. What do you want to do with it? I want her to know I understand. I want her to know that Thalia never betrayed her, that she lived with undeserved guilt for 50 years. I want her to know that I don't blame her for what she became, but I won't let it poison Tessie's life too. Margaret smiled sadly. Those are good wants. But wanting and achieving are different things. Your mother has built a life on that guilt, on those walls. Taking them down might break her. Leaving them up broke our family. Also true. Calvin made a decision. He went to the desk and pulled out paper, began writing. Dear Mother, he started, then stopped. He crumpled the paper and started again. Viola, he wrote. Better to be direct. The letter took him 3 hours to compose. He wrote about finding the house, about Thalia's diary, about the evidence. He wrote about understanding her pain, her fear, her need for control. He wrote about being James Whitmore's son and what that meant to him. But mostly, he wrote about forgiveness. About how Thalia had forgiven her, had loved her despite decades of silence. About how he forgave her too. Not because she deserved it, but because carrying anger was too heavy. About how Tessie deserved to know her grandmother, and Viola deserved to know her granddaughter. He ended with, I understand if you're not ready. I understand if you never will be. But I want you to know the truth. Thalia didn't betray you. Your father did. And you've been punishing everyone else for his crime for 50 years. It's time to put that burden down. If not for me, then for Tessie. She's innocent in all of this. Don't make her pay for sins committed before she was born. With understanding, if not yet forgiveness, Calvin. He sealed the letter and addressed it to Viola's house in Boston. Then he sat back, exhausted and oddly at peace. Will she respond? Margaret asked. I don't know, but I've done what I can. 2 days later, a letter arrived via overnight delivery. Not from Viola, but from an attorney representing Viola Dawn. It was a cease and desist order, threatening legal action if Calvin continued to contact his mother or spread slanderous lies about deceased family members. Calvin read it twice, feeling each word like a physical blow. She'd lawyered up. Rather than face the truth, she'd hidden behind legal protection. He showed the letter to Tessie, who'd asked why he looked so sad. Grandma still doesn't want to talk to us, he explained gently. Tessie studied the letter, her young face serious. She's scared. Yes. Of what? Of the truth. Of what she did. Of what was done to her. Of being wrong for so long. That's a lot to be scared of. It is. Tessie hugged him tight. We're okay without her, Dad. We have each other. We have this house. We have the truth now. That's more than we had before. Calvin held his daughter, marveling at her wisdom. She was right. They were okay. Better than okay. They had a home, stability, and the truth. If Viola couldn't accept those gifts, that was her choice. Her loss. But it still hurt. Understanding didn't erase pain. It just made it more bearable. That night, Calvin returned to the locked room and carefully filed everything away. Someday Tessie might want to read it all. Someday she'd need to know her family's complete history. But for now, it could rest. The truth was known, even if not yet acknowledged. He was James Whitmore's son. That changed nothing about who he was, but it explained so much about why Viola had become who she was. And in understanding, Calvin found a strange sort of peace. 3 weeks after the cease and desist letter, Richard Whitmore called requesting a meeting. His tone was formal, careful, and it set Calvin's nerves on edge. They met at Whitmore's office in town, a small suite above the hardware store that served as Millbrook's de facto legal center. There's something else, Whitmore said without preamble once they were seated. Something Miss Dawn asked me to give you only after you'd had time to settle, to understand the basics. I believe that time has come. He withdrew an envelope from his safe, sealed with wax that bore Thalia's initial. This is addressed to you specifically. She was adamant that it not be opened except in your presence, and only when you were ready to know everything. Whitmore's expression was somber. I think you should know before you open it that I mentioned in the contents the information will affect me as well. Calvin broke the seal and pulled out several documents. On top was a letter in Thalia's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before her death. My dear Calvin, it began. If you're reading this, you found the diaries. You know about James and Viola. You know about the fire. But there's one more truth, the most important one. The one I couldn't put in writing while I lived, but the one you deserve to know now. I hired a private investigator in 1985. I needed certainty about what happened that night. I needed proof of what my father did, not just for me, but for you. Because I suspected even then that you might be James's son, and I wanted you to have the full truth someday. The investigator found a witness, old Henry Morrison, who lived in a cabin near the barn. He saw everything that night but was too frightened to come forward. My father was a powerful man, and Henry was just a poor farmer with everything to lose. Henry's account was recorded. He saw your grandfather arrive at the barn after Viola and James were already inside. He saw the confrontation. He heard my father shouting that he'd rather see his daughter dead than disgraced. He saw my father lock the barn door from outside and set the fire. But here's what I never knew until Henry told the investigator. James didn't die in the fire. He made it out, badly burned, barely conscious, but alive. Viola got him out through a side window they broke together. My father was already gone, believing he'd killed them both. Viola took James to the only person she could trust, James's brother, Harold. Harold Whitmore, Richard's father. Harold got James to a hospital in the next county, registered under a false name. James lived, Calvin. He lived for another 3 days. Long enough to know that Viola was carrying his child. Long enough to make Harold promise to watch over that child from a distance. Long enough to tell Viola he forgave her, that he didn't blame her for her father's actions. When James died, from his injuries, from the smoke, from the trauma, they buried him quietly. Harold arranged it all. The official story stood. James Whitmore died in an accidental barn fire. Case closed. Viola left immediately after. She cut off everyone, including me, because the truth was too painful. She'd watched the man she loved die slowly, in agony, because of her father's hatred. She married Edward 2 months later, already showing, already broken. She built her new life on silence and control, because those were the only things that made her feel safe. But here's the truth that changes everything. You are James Whitmore's son, not just by blood, but legally. Before James died, he and Viola married. Harold performed the ceremony in the hospital, completely legal, completely binding. They were married for 3 days before he passed. Your mother was a widow when she married Edward Dorn. You were James's legitimate child. The marriage to Edward was legal because her first husband had died, but she never put James on your birth certificate. She gave you Edward's name, that everyone believed the timeline made sense. She did it to protect you from scandal, from questions, from her father's reach. But it means you're not the product of an affair or a secret romance gone wrong. Your parents were married. They loved each other. Your existence was legitimate and wanted. I've enclosed your parents' marriage certificate. Harold kept it all these years. Richard has known this truth his entire adult life. He's watched over you as his uncle requested, quietly, from a distance. I'm telling you this now because you deserve to know you were born from love, not shame. And because Richard Whitmore isn't just a family attorney. He's your family. James was his uncle, which makes you his cousin. You're not alone, Calvin. You've never been alone. There are people who've loved you, watched over you, waited for you to find your way home. Welcome home, my dear boy. Welcome to the truth. With all my love. Thalia. Calvin couldn't breathe. The room spun. He read the letter again, then a third time, before finally looking up at Richard Whitmore, at his cousin, who sat across the desk with tears in his eyes. You knew, Calvin whispered. You've always known. My father told me when I was 18, made me promise to honor Uncle James's request, to watch over you, to help however I could without revealing why. Richard's voice was thick with emotion. When Miss Dawn contacted me about the will, about leaving everything to you, I knew it was time. She and I talked many times about when to tell you, how to tell you. She wanted you settled first, wanted you to understand the context before hitting you with this. Calvin looked at the marriage certificate. His parents, James Patrick Whitmore and Viola Ann Dawn. Married July 15th, 1966. Witnessed by Harold Whitmore and a hospital chaplain. 3 days before James's death. I have a family, Calvin said, the words feeling surreal. An actual family. James's family. We've wanted to know you your whole life, Richard said. But Viola made it clear. Any contact, any acknowledgement, and she'd disappear completely. We couldn't risk losing all connection, so we waited. My father waited until his death 5 years ago. I've waited, and now, finally, we can stop waiting. He stood and moved around the desk, and suddenly Calvin was being embraced by a man he'd thought was just a professional acquaintance. His cousin, his family. There are others, Richard said. My father had 2 other children, my siblings, your cousins. There's my mother, who knew Uncle James and loved him dearly. There's an entire family who's wanted to welcome you home. Calvin thought of Viola, alone in her Boston house, surrounded by the family she'd chosen over the truth. And here he was, surrounded by the family she had hidden from him, the family that had loved him from a distance his entire life. Does she know, Calvin asked, that you've been watching over me? I don't know what she knows or suspects. We haven't spoken since you were a baby. She cut us off as completely as she cut off Thalia. The cease and desist letter, was that really from her? Richard nodded grimly. Her attorney is unfortunately doing exactly what she asked. She's built walls so high she can't see over them anymore. Calvin stood and walked to the window, looking out at Millbrook's snowy Main Street. Everything had changed. He wasn't the product of scandal and shame. He was the son of a man who'd loved his mother enough to marry her in his dying days. He had family who'd waited decades to claim him. And Viola had spent those decades in self-imposed exile, carrying unnecessary shame, punishing herself and everyone around her for choices that weren't even hers. I want to meet them, Calvin said. James's family. My family. They're ready whenever you are. My mother especially. She's 83 now, but sharp as ever. She's wanted to meet you since the day you were born. Calvin turned back to Richard. And I want to try one more time with Viola. She needs to know I know everything now, that I understand, that I'm not judging her, just asking her to stop judging herself. She may not listen. She probably won't, but I have to try, for James, for Thalia, for Tessie, and for me. Richard nodded slowly. Then we'll try together. Family helps family. That's what Uncle James would have wanted. Family. The word felt different now. Heavier. Fuller. Real. Calvin had spent 3 years believing he was alone except for Tessie. Now he knew he'd never been alone at all. The revelation sent Calvin into a week of emotional turmoil. He'd wake in the middle of the night, mind racing through everything he'd learned, everything it meant. He was James Whitmore's legitimate son. His parents had been married, however, briefly. His mother had lived with this secret for nearly 50 years. Tessie noticed the change immediately. At 11, she developed the ability to read his moods with uncanny accuracy. You found out something big, didn't you? She asked one morning over breakfast. Calvin set down his coffee and looked at his daughter, his brilliant, perceptive daughter who deserved the truth as much as he had. I did. Something that changes our family history. He took a breath. Your grandfather, the man I always called father, wasn't actually my biological father. Tessie's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. My real father was a man named James Whitmore. He loved your grandmother very much. They were even married for 3 days before he died from injuries he got trying to protect her from her father, your great-great-grandfather. So Grandma was a widow. She was. And then she remarried and never told anyone. She let me believe Edward Dorn was my father my whole life. Tessie processed this slowly. So that's why she's so angry all the time. She's sad. She lost someone she loved and never got over it. Out of the mouths of babes. That's exactly right. And Mr. Whitmore, the attorney, is my cousin. James was his uncle. There's a whole family that's wanted to know us, but your grandmother kept us apart. Tessie was quiet for a moment. Are we going to meet them? Would you like to? There are family. Of course I want to meet them. The simplicity of her response made Calvin smile. No complicated feelings about loyalty or betrayal, just the straightforward acceptance that family mattered, regardless of how they'd been kept apart. Richard arranged the meeting for the following Saturday. It would be held at his mother's house, a sprawling farmhouse just outside Millbrook. The guest list included Richard's mother, Eleanor, his two siblings and their families, and a few of James's closest friends who were still living. The night before, Richard brought Calvin something he said he'd been saving for the right moment. It was a pocket watch, tarnished with age but still functional. On the back, an inscription, "For our future, JW to VD, summer 1966. Uncle James was wearing this when he was injured, Richard explained. It stopped at 11:47 p.m., the exact time of the fire. My father kept it all these years. He wanted me to give it to you when you were ready." Calvin held the watch, feeling the weight of history in his palm. His father had carried this, had given it to Viola as a promise of their future, a future that had been stolen from them. "Thank you," Calvin managed, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something else." Richard withdrew a photograph from his wallet. "This is the only picture I have of Uncle James and Viola together, taken secretly, probably by my father. I thought you should see what they looked like when they were happy." The photograph showed a young couple on a riverbank, obviously unaware they were being photographed. James had his arm around Viola, and she was laughing at something he'd said. Both looked utterly content, completely in love. Calvin could see himself in James's features. The same jawline, the same way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "She was so young," Calvin whispered. 25. James was 28. They thought they had all the time in the world. That night, Calvin showed everything to Tessie. The watch, the photograph, the marriage certificate. They sat together on the library couch, pieces of history spread before them. "They look happy," Tessie observed, studying the photograph. They were. "Do you think Grandma still remembers being that happy?" "I don't know. I hope so. I hope she hasn't forgotten everything good that happened before everything went wrong." Tessie picked up the watch, examining it carefully. "Can we show her these things? Can we tell her we know?" "I want to try. But she's made it very clear she doesn't want contact. Maybe she just needs to know it's safe, that we're not judging her, that we understand." Calvin pulled his daughter close. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher." The meeting with James's family was overwhelming in the best way. Eleanor Whitmore was a small woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile that reminded Calvin immediately of the grandmother he'd never known he should have had. "You look so much like him," she said, touching Calvin's face gently. "James would be so proud of the man you've become, of the father you are." Richard's siblings, David and Patricia, welcomed Calvin and Tessie without reservation. They were cousins too. Second cousins, technically, but family nonetheless. Children running around, adults sharing stories, a genuine family gathering that Calvin had never experienced growing up in Viola's cold, formal household. They shared stories about James, his kindness, his sense of humor, his absolute devotion to Viola, despite knowing the relationship was dangerous. Eleanor showed them photographs Calvin had never seen. James as a boy, as a young man, in his work clothes at the construction company he'd helped run. He was going to take over the business, Eleanor said. He and Viola were going to move to Boston, start fresh. He had it all planned out. Then that monster... She stopped herself, glancing at Tessie. Then Viola's father destroyed everything. "Did you ever talk to my mother?" Calvin asked. "After?" "Once. I went to see her about a month after James died. She was already showing. I wanted her to know we'd help her, that James's son would have family. She refused to see me, sent a message through her husband that the past was dead and I should respect that. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how," Calvin said. "I know that now. Then, I was just angry. Angry at her for cutting us off, for denying us our nephew, for pretending James never existed. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. But I've had 50 years to learn forgiveness. I just hope she's learned it too. Over lunch, Calvin made a decision. He stood and cleared his throat, waiting for the conversations to quiet. I want to thank you all for welcoming us, for waiting so patiently to be part of our lives. Tessie and I have been on our own for a long time, and it means everything to know we have family. He paused, gathering courage. I'm going to try to reach out to my mother one more time. She needs to know that I know the truth, that I understand, that there's forgiveness available if she wants it. I'm not expecting her to change, but I owe it to James's memory to try. Eleanor stood and took his hand. James would want that. He loved her until his last breath. He'd want reconciliation if it's possible. Will you come with me? Calvin asked Richard. As family. As a witness that we're not alone anymore? Of course. Patricia added, take the photograph. Let her see that we remember them happy. Let her know we don't blame her. The next 3 days were spent preparing. Calvin wrote and rewrote what he wanted to say. He practiced with Tessie, who played devil's advocate, asking the hard questions Viola might ask. What if she slams the door in your face? Tessie asked. Then at least I'll know I tried. What if she calls the police? Then we leave. We don't push. We offer the truth and let her decide what to do with it. What if she cries? That one stopped Calvin. He hadn't considered that his mother might break down. She'd always been so controlled, so rigid. But beneath that control was a girl who'd watched the man she loved die slowly, who'd carried guilt and grief for 50 years. Then I comfort her, he said finally. Even if she doesn't want it, even if she pushes me away, I show her that kindness is still possible. Margaret Pelletier insisted on making them a care package. Cookies and tea in a beautiful knitted blanket. For when the conversation gets hard, she explained. Sometimes people need something to hold on to. The night before they were scheduled to drive to Boston, Calvin stood in the study where Thalia had kept her secrets. He held the pocket watch in one hand and the photograph in the other. I'm going to try to finish what you started, he told the empty room, speaking to Thalia's memory. I'm going to offer her truth and love and a chance to be part of our lives. The rest is up to her. The watch ticked steadily in his hand, keeping time after all these years. Just like love, he thought. Just like family. They endured, even when everything else fell apart. Tomorrow they would drive to Boston. Tomorrow he would face his mother with the full truth. Tomorrow he would offer her the gift Thalia had tried to give for 50 years. The gift of understanding, forgiveness, and family. Whether she accepted it was entirely up to her. The drive to Boston took 4 hours through increasingly gray weather. Calvin drove, with Richard in the passenger seat and Tessie in the back, quiet and observant. None of them spoke much. The weight of what they were about to attempt sat heavy in the car. Viola's house was in a quiet suburb, a modest colonial that spoke of careful maintenance and deliberate isolation. The yard was pristine even in winter, the walkway meticulously cleared of snow. Everything about it screamed control. Calvin parked at the curb. His hands were shaking. You don't have to do this, Richard said quietly. Yes, I do. They walked to the door together. 3 generations carrying truth and hope in the memories of people long gone. Calvin rang the doorbell and waited. The woman who opened the door was older than Calvin remembered, though it had only been 3 years since he'd seen her. Viola had aged in that time, her hair completely gray now, her face deeply lined. But her eyes, those eyes that had looked through him at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, were the same. Sharp, wary, defensive. She saw Calvin first and started to close the door. Then she saw Richard, and her face went absolutely white. No, she whispered. No, you can't be here. Mrs. Dawn, Richard said gently. We need to talk. Please. I'll call the police. I have a restraining order. You don't, Calvin interrupted. You have a cease and desist letter about contact, not a restraining order, and I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I know everything now, about James, about the fire, about my real father. Viola's hand flew to her chest, where, beneath her modest blouse, Calvin could see the outline of something hanging on a chain, a locket. She'd been wearing it all along. I don't know what you're talking about. But her voice shook. Please. Tessie's small voice came from behind Calvin. Please, Grandma. We just want to talk. We just want to understand. Viola's eyes found Tessie for the first time. Really saw her. Perhaps for the first time ever. Saw her granddaughter, 11 years old, looking up at her with green eyes that were so like her own. Something in Viola's face cracked. Just a little. Just enough. You brought a child into this. She's your granddaughter. She deserves to know you. I'm nothing worth knowing. That's not true, Calvin said, and I can prove it. Please, Mom, just give us 5 minutes. If you still want us to leave after that, we'll go and never come back. But please, let us say what we came to say. The use of Mom seemed to break something else. Viola's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back furiously. For a long moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, a woman caught between the past she'd buried and the present demanding to be acknowledged. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. 5 minutes. That's all. They entered a house that felt like a museum. Everything was in its place, nothing personal visible except for carefully curated family photographs that pointedly excluded Calvin and Tessie. The living room was formal, unwelcoming. They sat on furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable. Viola remained standing, arms crossed, defenses fully engaged. But Calvin could see her hand kept going to that locket at her throat. A nervous gesture she probably didn't even realize she was making. How did you find out? She asked finally. Thalia left me everything. The house, her diaries, the evidence she'd collected, and Richard's father's testimony about what really happened that night. Viola's eyes flickered to Richard. Harold's dead. 5 years ago, Richard confirmed. But he left me everything, including Uncle James' last wishes. Don't. The word was sharp, desperate. Don't say his name. James Whitmore, Calvin said gently. My father, your husband, the man who loved you enough to marry you in a hospital bed while dying from burns your father gave him. Viola's control shattered. She sat down hard on the nearest chair, hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The locket chain broke under her grip, and the locket fell open in her lap, revealing a tiny photograph of a young man with kind eyes and a smile full of promise. You kept his picture, Calvin whispered. All these years. Viola looked at the locket in her hands as if seeing it for the first time. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I've worn him every day. Every single day for 50 years, and I've worn my shame right alongside him. The silence that followed was profound. Viola sat with the broken locket in her hands, shoulders shaking with decades of suppressed grief. Calvin moved slowly, carefully, sitting on the floor beside her chair. Not crowding her, just being present. I blame Thalia, Viola finally said. I thought she told my father where we were meeting. I thought she betrayed us. She never did, Calvin said gently. Your father followed you. Thalia tried to protect you both. She spent 50 years trying to tell you the truth. I wouldn't listen. I couldn't listen. Viola's voice broke. If I listened, if I let myself believe her, then I'd have to face that I'd spent all these years hating the wrong person, that I'd punished my sister, cut off everyone who loved me, for something she never did. She understood, Richard said quietly. She never stopped loving you. She should have. Viola looked at him, really looked at him. You're Harold's son. You look like him. I am. And Uncle James was my hero growing up. My father made sure I knew him, even though he was gone. He died because of me. He died because your father was a monster, Calvin corrected firmly. Because he chose violence over understanding. James knew the risks. He loved you anyway. And from everything I've learned, he never regretted that choice. Not even at the end. Viola wiped her eyes with shaking hands. You know everything. Everything Talia documented. Everything Richard's father witnessed. We know you were married. We know James lived for 3 days after the fire. We know he forgave you, loved you, wanted his son to know his story. His son. Viola looked at Calvin, and for the first time he saw recognition in her eyes. Not just acknowledgement of his existence, but seeing him. You look like him. I've spent 43 years trying not to see it, but you look exactly like him. I do, Calvin confirmed. And I'm proud of that. He was a good man who loved you and tried to build a life with you. There's no shame in that, Mom. There never was. When you got divorced, Viola whispered. When you chose to raise Tessie alone, all I could see was my worst fear. I was pregnant and alone. If Edward hadn't married me, if he hadn't given you his name, you would have been illegitimate. A scandal. I would have been ruined. But I wasn't alone by circumstance. I was alone by choice. I chose Tessie. I chose honesty over appearance. And you couldn't forgive me for having the courage you didn't have. Viola flinched. You're right. I hated that you got to make that choice. That you got to be brave when I was so afraid. Tessie, who'd been sitting quietly, spoke up. It's okay to have been afraid, Grandma. You were just young, and your father was mean, but you don't have to be afraid anymore. Viola looked at her granddaughter, this wise child who offered forgiveness so simply. I don't know how not to be afraid. You start small, Calvin said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph Patricia had sent. This is you and James. Happy. Before everything went wrong. Richard's family has kept this photo for 50 years, waiting to share it with you, waiting to tell you they never blamed you. Viola took the photograph with trembling hands. A sob escaped her as she looked at herself and James. So young, so full of hope. We were so happy that day. He just told me he'd saved enough money for us to move to Boston. We were going to be married in secret and just leave. Start over. You could still start over, Richard said. Not geographically, but emotionally. James's family, your son's family, wants to know you. We've wanted to know you for decades. How can you forgive me? I cut you off. I denied Calvin his heritage. I was cruel. Because you were hurting, Richard replied. Because you were doing what you thought you had to do to survive. But you don't have to survive anymore, Mrs. Dawn. You can live. Really live. With family who understands, who doesn't judge, who just wants to know you. Viola looked at each of them in turn. Calvin, who'd driven 4 hours to offer understanding instead of accusation. Richard, representing a family she'd refused for 50 years. And Tessie, this beautiful child who'd been denied a grandmother's love because of one woman's fear and shame. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so deeply, terribly sorry. Calvin reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. I forgive you, Mom. And Thalia forgave you long ago. The only person who needs to forgive you now is yourselves. Viola clutched his hand like a lifeline. I don't know if I can. Then we'll help you learn. That's what families do. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and cleansing. Inside, in a house that had felt like a mausoleum, 3 generations sat together in the first honest moment they'd ever shared. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was a beginning. And after 50 years of endings, a beginning was enough. Spring came to Vermont with its usual dramatic transformation. Snow melted into rushing streams, bare trees burst into green, and the gardens around the mansion revealed themselves in layers of color. Calvin stood on the back porch, coffee in hand, watching Tessie help Viola plant flowers in the raised beds they'd built together. It had been 3 months since that day in Boston. 3 months of careful rebuilding, of phone calls and visits, of learning to be a family. It hadn't been easy. There were setbacks, moments when Viola's old patterns reasserted themselves, when fear made her pull back. But she kept trying. They all kept trying. A little deeper, Viola was telling Tessie now, demonstrating the proper depth for planting bulbs. These will come back every year if we do it right. Every year. The phrase spoke to permanence, to a future Viola was finally allowing herself to imagine. The back door opened, and Richard appeared with his mother, Eleanor. The Whitmore family had become regular visitors, weaving themselves into Calvin's life with the ease of people who'd always been meant to be there. "The quilt is finished," Eleanor announced, carrying a large wrapped bundle. "I think you're going to love it." They gathered in the library, which had become the heart of the house. Books lined the walls, comfortable furniture invited long conversations, and photographs now covered every surface. 3 generations finding their way back to each other. Eleanor unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing a quilt of extraordinary beauty. Each square represented a family member, carefully designed and stitched together. Calvin recognized the patterns immediately. They were from Thalia's unfinished quilt, the one they'd found in the attic with that final note pinned to it. For when the family is whole again. Thalia had made 20 squares before she passed, Eleanor explained. "I finished the rest. Here's James, here's Thalia, here's Viola as a young woman, and here are all of us now, Calvin, Tessie, everyone who's part of this family." In the center was a square showing a house, the mansion, with windows glowing warmly. Home. Viola reached out to touch the square that represented her youngest self. She never stopped believing we'd come back together. She knew love was stronger than fear, Eleanor said. She just had to wait for the rest of us to figure it out. They spread the quilt across the large reading table, admiring Eleanor's work. The final square, the one Thalia had left unfinished, now showed all of them together. Her family, complete at last. "I want to show you something," Viola said quietly. She left the room and returned a moment later, carrying a small wooden box. "I've kept these all these years. I thought they were just painful memories. But Calvin's been helping me understand them more than that. Their history, their truth." She opened the box to reveal letters. Dozens of letters from James, written during their courtship when they had to communicate in secret. Love letters, full of hope and plans and promises. "I want Tessie to have these someday," Viola said. "So she knows what real love looks like. So she knows her grandfather was a good man who loved fiercely and bravely." Tessie came to stand beside her grandmother, and Viola's arm went around her automatically now, the gesture becoming natural through repetition. "Thank you, Grandma. Thank you for giving an old fool a second chance." The afternoon dissolved into the comfortable rhythm they'd developed. Richard and Calvin discussed the scholarship fund they were establishing in James's name. Money from Thalia's estate combined with contributions from the Whitmore family, designed to help young people from difficult circumstances pursue education. Eleanor and Viola pored over old photographs, filling in gaps in family history, reclaiming memories. That evening, after everyone had left, Calvin walked the grounds with Viola. The gardens were coming back to life under her care, responding to attention they hadn't received in years. "I never thought I'd be here," Viola said. "In this house, surrounded by family, at peace." "Thalia knew you would be. Eventually. She had more faith than I deserved. She had exactly the right amount of faith, and she was patient enough to wait." They stopped at the old barn site. It had been cleared long ago, but Viola had insisted on placing a memorial there, a simple stone marker engraved with James's name and dates, and the words, "He loved bravely." Viola knelt and placed fresh flowers at the stone, something she did weekly now. I'm learning to forgive myself. It's harder than forgiving everyone else. It usually is. But I'm trying, for you, for Tessie, for James. She stood and looked at Calvin. You saved me, you know. Coming here, refusing to give up on me. You saved my life. You saved yourself. I just held the door open. They walked back to the house as twilight deepened. Through the windows, they could see Tessie in the library, reading in the same chair Thalia had favored. The house was full of life again, full of voices and laughter and the comfortable sounds of family. This is what she wanted, Viola said softly. Thalia wanted the house filled with family, wanted us to find our way back to each other, wanted the secrets to finally stop causing pain. She gave us a gift, Calvin agreed. Not just the house or the money. She gave us the truth. And truth, it turns out, really does set you free. Inside, Tessie called for them. Time for dinner, she said. Time for the family meal that had become their nightly ritual. Calvin looked at the mansion. His home, his inheritance, his responsibility and joy. In its windows, light glowed warm and welcoming. On its porch, 3 generations were learning to be a family. In its rooms, memories both painful and precious were finally being honored. Thalia had been right. The house had been too quiet for too long. It had needed laughter again, needed a child's footsteps on the stairs, needed people who understood what mattered. It had needed love. And now, finally, it had it.